Imagine a sound, a series of wet, horrifying clicks that echo from the darkness ahead. It's a sound that doesn't belong to any animal you know, a sound that scrapes against your primal instincts. You freeze. Every muscle in your body screams at you to run, to get away. But your brain, honed by 20 years of survival, knows better. In this new world, running is a death sentence. Making a sound is an invitation. This is the first and most brutal lesson the apocalypse teaches. The world is listening, and the things that listen are not your friends. This isn't a battle of strength. It's a masterclass in the art of becoming a ghost. The primary threat, the ever-present horror of this world, isn't just that the infected are strong or fast. It's that they have redefined the very rules of engagement. For humanity, sight has always been our dominant sense. We look, we see, we react. But for the most dangerous stages of the cordyceps infection, sight is irrelevant. The clicker, blind and grotesquely transformed, navigates the world through a form of primitive, terrifyingly effective echolocation. Every sound you make, a cough, a clumsy step on broken glass, the metallic scrape of a pipe against a wall, paints a perfect target on your back. The problem isn't just avoiding monsters. It's unlearning a lifetime of habits. It's learning to exist in a world where the floor itself is a minefield of noise. The solution, born from sheer necessity, is a thing of tactical beauty. Survivors learn to move with a kind of grace that would make a predator proud. Picture this. You don't just walk. You enter a state of hyper-awareness. You crouch, lowering your center of gravity, minimizing your silhouette. Each step is a deliberate, calculated decision. Your foot hovers for a moment, testing the ground before you commit your full weight. Is it broken glass? A loose floorboard? A pile of papers that will rustle just a little too loudly? This isn't just being quiet. It's a form of moving meditation, an intimate conversation with the environment. Survivors learn to read the texture of the world through the soles of their worn-out shoes, becoming masters of the silent step. They don't fight the silence. They become part of it. But what about the dangers you can't see? The clicker shuffling in the next room, the stalker hiding just behind a doorway. This is where the human mind performed its most ingenious trick. It developed its own version of sonar. Survivors call it listen mode, but it's not a superpower. It's the art of focused perception, honed to a razor's edge. You stop, control your breathing, and simply listen. You filter out the wind, the creaking of the building, and you focus on the unnatural sounds. The wet gurgle of a runner, the telltale clicking. You begin to build a 3D map of your surroundings using sound alone. You can trace the patrol path of an infected through a wall, not by seeing them, but by understanding how their sounds echo and travel through the space. It's a level of auditory awareness that modern humans have long forgotten. A primal skill reawakened by a world that demands it. Of course, even a ghost can get cornered. Sometimes silence isn't an option. And in those moments, the survivor's genius shines brightest. They don't panic. They become conductors of a deadly orchestra. The weapon of choice? Not a gun, but a brick, a bottle, a simple, throwable object. This isn't just a distraction. It's a strategic manipulation of the enemy's greatest strength. A perfectly thrown bottle shatters against a far wall, and every infected in the area, their senses screaming at the sudden noise, turns and sprints towards the sound. They are puppets, and the survivor is pulling their strings. For a few precious seconds, a path is cleared. This simple act, using sound to control a sound-based enemy, is one of the most profound examples of tactical brilliance in this desolate world. Mastering the art of invisibility, of becoming a whisper in a world that screams, was the foundational skill for anyone who wanted to see another sunrise. It was a delicate, terrifying dance of silence and misdirection. But being a ghost was only the first step, because you can't eat silence, and you can't stitch a wound with shadows. The real, grinding, day-to-day challenge began when the hunger set in, and survivors had to learn an entirely new and far more difficult art. How to find life in a world that had been picked clean to the bone. The silence you've mastered can keep you alive, but it can't fill your stomach. Hunger, in this new world, is a slow, creeping predator, just as deadly as any clicker. 20 years of decay has transformed the landscape into a graveyard of civilization. Supermarket shelves were stripped bare a generation ago. Canned goods, the holy grail of the apocalypse, are now rarer than gold. The problem is brutally simple. The world is empty. The stores, the homes, the warehouses, they've all been picked over, looted, and left to rot. For a new survivor, the sight of a ransacked grocery store is a portrait of despair. But for the veteran, it's just a canvas. They've learned that finding sustenance isn't about luck. It's about reading the stories left behind in the ruins. This is where the true genius of the survivor shines, transforming them from a mere looter into a kind of post-apocalyptic archaeologist. They don't just see an abandoned house, they see a timeline. They ask the critical questions. Was this house evacuated in a hurry? If so, people might have left behind valuables in their panic. Or was it lived in for years after the outbreak? That's even better. It means the occupants were resourceful. They might have hidden a stash of supplies, not in the obvious places like the kitchen pantry, but under a loose floorboard, inside a water tank, or sealed behind a wall. A seasoned scavenger knows that the most valuable treasures are never in plain sight. They are protected by the one thing that has survived as long as they have: paranoia. The art is in thinking, like someone who was desperate to hide their last can of peaches from the rest of the world. Picture yourself in a derelict coffee shop. The amateur sees broken mugs and upturned tables. The expert, however, looks past the chaos. They check behind the counters, inside the cistern of the toilet, and even in the ventilation shafts. They know that in the early days, people hid things in places they thought no one would ever look. But the real game changer is understanding that not all food comes in a can. This is where we separate the survivors from the victims. Your average person sees a patch of weeds and walks on by. A true survivor, however, sees a potential meal. They've cultivated a priceless knowledge of botany and mycology, the kind of wisdom our ancestors took for granted. They know which mushrooms are safe to eat and which will lead to an agonizing end. They recognize the hardy, edible plants that thrive in urban decay. In this world, a dusty old book on local flora is more valuable than a shotgun, because a shotgun can run out of ammo, but knowledge feeds you forever. This expertise extends beyond just food. A scavenger's symphony is about orchestrating the perfect haul of interconnected materials. They don't just grab a bottle of whiskey. They see it for what it truly is: a powerful antiseptic for cleaning a wound, a sterilizer for their tools, or the key ingredient for a Molotov cocktail. A dusty rag isn't trash. It's a potential bandage, a filter for dirty water, or the wrapping for a shiv. This is the mindset of total utility. Everything, from a child's broken toy to a rusty pair of scissors, is assessed not for what it was, but for what it could become. They see the world as a giant, disassembled machine, and their job is to find the missing parts. This mental shift from consumer to creator is one of the most critical adaptations for long-term survival. But this relentless search is a high-stakes gamble. Every unopened door, every dark corner, could be a trap. The same desperation that forces you to scavenge drives others to hunt the scavengers. A too obvious stash of supplies, a door left invitingly ajar. These could be the bait in a hunter's snare. So the ultimate skill isn't just finding resources, but recognizing when a find is too good to be true. It's about reading the subtle environmental clues: a fresh footprint in the dust, a recently moved object, a tripwire almost invisible stretched across a doorway. The most successful scavengers are not the bravest. They are the most observant and, frankly, the most paranoid. This life of constant, grinding searching of sifting through the debris of a dead civilization, is exhausting. It wears on the body and the soul. After a long day of narrowly avoiding death and finding only a handful of scraps, the survivor needs more than just food. They need a place to rest, to patch their wounds, and to momentarily shut out the horrors of the world. But in a landscape where every building is a potential tomb, finding a safe place to sleep is a challenge all its own, requiring an entirely different kind of strategic genius. You've found enough scraps to survive another day. Your stomach is quiet, for now. But as the light begins to fade, a different, more primal fear takes hold. The things that hunt in this world are most active at night. The darkness isn't just an absence of light. It's a living, breathing predator. You can't outrun them, you can't fight all of them, so you have to disappear. The problem is, there are no safe places left. Hotels are death traps, police stations are overrun, and even a locked door is just a temporary suggestion to a determined infected or a desperate human. Every night presents the same terrifying question. How do you turn a random, forgotten corner of the world into a fortress, just for a few hours? The answer is a masterclass in tactical defense and psychological warfare, executed with nothing but refuse and a deep understanding of your enemy. The first rule of creating a safe house is choosing the right location. It's never the most obvious place. A ground-floor apartment with large windows is a death wish. Instead, the veteran survivor thinks vertically. An upper-floor apartment in a residential building, a forgotten storage room in the back of a warehouse, or even a precarious spot on a fire escape. The ideal location has two critical features: limited entry points and a secondary escape route. You need a place where you can funnel any potential threat into a single, controllable choke point. But you also need a plan B, a window to a lower roof, a weakened wall you can break through. Being trapped is as good as being dead. Once a location is chosen, the transformation begins. This isn't about building permanent walls, it's about creating an early warning system. The survivor becomes an artist of subtle traps. Picture this. You find a handful of empty glass bottles. You don't hoard them for water. Instead, you carefully string them together with a bit of salvaged twine and hang them just inside the doorway. It's a primitive alarm system. Anyone or anything pushing through that door will create a cascade of shattering glass, giving you precious seconds to wake up and react. A line of broken plates can be laid in a hallway. A heavy piece of furniture isn't just a barricade, it's a noisemaker. Pushing it aside takes time and, more importantly, it makes a sound. The goal isn't always to stop the intruder, but to ensure you hear them coming long before they see you. But what about the threats you can't hear? What about other humans who are smart enough to look for these kinds of traps? This is where the psychological element comes in. The art of the safe house is also the art of misdirection. A survivor might intentionally leave a downstairs door slightly ajar, making it look like the place has already been looted and abandoned. They might create a sloppy barricade at one entrance, drawing attention to it, while their true, heavily fortified position is hidden elsewhere. They learn to make their temporary home look uninviting, worthless, or already picked clean. It's a silent message to anyone who might be passing by. There's nothing for you here. Move on. Inside this temporary fortress, every action is deliberate. There are no open flames, which can be seen for miles. Light comes from a heavily shielded flashlight, or more often, not at all, as your eyes adjust to the gloom. Every movement is slow and muffled. You don't just drop your pack on the floor, you place it down gently. It's a continuation of the same discipline required to navigate the streets, but now applied to a single, confined space. The safe house isn't just a physical structure. It's a bubble of absolute silence and control in a world of chaos. It's a place to do more than just sleep. It's a workshop, a triage center, and a sanctuary for the mind. Here, in this fragile haven, the real work of survival continues. You lay out your scavenged treasures. That dirty rag and bottle of alcohol are now being used to clean a festering cut. That handful of blades and bindings are being assembled into a weapon. This is the moment where the raw materials found during the day are transformed into the tools of tomorrow's survival. The safe house is the factory floor of the apocalypse, but this raises a new, critical problem. Your makeshift alarm system can warn you of an approaching monster, but it can't fix a broken bone or create a bomb out of thin air. For that, you need a different kind of genius, the ingenuity of a post-apocalyptic engineer. You're safe, for now, inside your temporary fortress. The world outside is a cacophony of clicks and groans, but in here, there is a tense, focused silence. But safety is fleeting. The knife you carry is chipped, you have only 3 bullets left for your pistol, and your only medical supply is a stained bandage. The fundamental problem of this world is that it is no longer a world of consumers. It's a world of creators, born from the most brutal necessity. You cannot find what you need, you must make it. And what you have to make it with is the debris of a fallen civilization, a roll of tape, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, a pair of old scissors, and a handful of sugar. To an ordinary person, it's a pile of junk. To a survivor, it's an arsenal. This is where humanity's latent genius for engineering reemerges in its most primitive and beautiful form. It's a return to first principles. You don't need a factory. You need to understand the fundamental properties of the things around you. Take that pair of rusty scissors. Useless for cutting paper, perhaps. But if you break them apart, sharpen one of the blades on a concrete floor, and tightly wrap the handle with a strip of cloth for grip, you haven't just repaired a tool, you've created a shiv. It's a silent, deadly, and endlessly reusable weapon, born from an object everyone else would have ignored. This isn't just crafting, it's a form of post-apocalyptic alchemy, turning worthless metal into a lifeline. The same logic applies to a simple brick or a length of pipe. Add a few carefully placed blades, bind them with duct tape, and you've created a brutal, effective melee weapon that never runs out of ammunition. The real masterpiece of this improvised science, however, is the Molotov cocktail. It's a perfect symbol of apocalyptic ingenuity. On their own, a bottle of alcohol and a rag are moderately useful. One is an antiseptic, the other a bandage. But when combined, they become something far greater than the sum of their parts. They become a tool of area denial, a weapon of terror. A survivor knows that a single, well-placed Molotov can do what a dozen bullets cannot. It can control a crowd. It creates a wall of fire that can block a hallway, flush enemies out of cover, or incinerate a group of runners in a single brilliant flash. Crafting one is an act of understanding basic chemistry, the flammable nature of alcohol, the wicking property of cloth. It's a testament to the idea that in this world, knowledge of physics is a more powerful weapon than brute force. But the genius isn't limited to weapons. In fact, the most clever creations are the ones that save your life, not take someone else's. Consider the smoke bomb. It's a work of tactical art, made from the most unlikely of ingredients: sugar, and a simple explosive agent scavenged from fertilizer or cleaning supplies. The amateur thinks of it as a way to escape. The expert uses it as a tool of confusion. A well-deployed smoke bomb can mask your escape, but it can also disorient a group of human enemies, allowing you to slip past them or take them down one by one while they are coughing and blind. It's a non-lethal solution in a world that so often demands bloodshed, proof that the smartest move is often the one that avoids a fight altogether. Even the humble first aid kit is a marvel of resourcefulness. You don't find sterile gauze and antiseptic wipes. You create them. A clean rag, soaked in that scavenged alcohol, becomes a disinfectant wipe. A different rag, tightly rolled, becomes a pressure bandage. The survivor learns to see the potential for healing in the most mundane objects. They are not just warriors and scavengers. They are doctors, chemists, and engineers, all rolled into one. Their backpack isn't just a collection of items, it's a mobile workshop, a portable laboratory filled with the potential to create, to heal, and to kill. This ability to see beyond an object's intended purpose, to see the shiv in the scissors, the bomb in the sugar, is the beating heart of survival. It's a constant, creative dialogue with a dead world. But even the most ingenious weapon is useless if you're taken down by an enemy you can't see. The most carefully crafted bandage means nothing if the water you're drinking is slowly poisoning you from the inside. The next great challenge wasn't just fending off the monsters you could see, but fighting a war against an army of invisible killers. You've built a fortress. You've crafted a weapon. You feel for a moment like you have a handle on this world. You can dodge a clicker and outsmart a bandit. But then you drink from the wrong puddle, or you get a deep cut from a rusty piece of metal while climbing through a window. Suddenly, the greatest threat you face isn't a monster with claws and teeth. It's a microscopic invader, now raging through your bloodstream. In the old world, a course of antibiotics or a tetanus shot would have been an afterthought. In this world, a simple infection is a death sentence, delivered slowly and agonizingly. The problem is immense. How do you fight a war against an enemy you cannot see in a world without doctors, pharmacies, or even clean running water? The solution was a forced regression, a return to a kind of medical wisdom that had been lost for generations, supplemented by the scraps of modern science. The first and most critical battle was the war for clean water. A survivor quickly learned that clear water is not the same as clean water. That pristine-looking stream could be teeming with bacteria from the decaying corpse of a deer lying just upstream. So they became masters of makeshift purification. The most brilliant and common solution was beautifully simple: the charcoal filter. You take a container, maybe a plastic bottle with the bottom cut off. You layer it with cloth, sand, and then the crucial ingredient: charcoal, salvaged from old fires. As the dirty water passes through, the porous carbon in the charcoal traps impurities and bacteria. It's a primitive Brita filter, a piece of life-saving science you can build with trash. And when in doubt, the oldest rule of all applied: boil it. A survivor knew that a rolling boil, even for a minute, was the surest way to kill the invisible things that wanted you dead. The second front in this war was wound care. Every scratch, every scrape, was a potential gateway for catastrophic infection. The survivor's approach to this was a masterclass in pragmatic field medicine. Your most valuable resource wasn't a fancy first aid kit, but that bottle of high-proof alcohol you scavenged. It wasn't for drinking away the sorrow, it was liquid gold. A splash of whiskey or vodka on a fresh wound would burn like hellfire, but it was a cleansing fire, killing the germs before they could take root. It was used to sterilize the blade of your knife before you dug out a splinter, or to clean a needle before you attempted to stitch a deep gash with salvaged thread. This act of tactical self-torture, inflicting sharp, clean pain to prevent a slow, festering death, was a hallmark of the hardened survivor. They also became foragers of a different kind, not just for food, but for medicine. They learned to recognize plants with antiseptic or soothing properties. They knew that certain types of moss could be used as an absorbent, sterile dressing for a wound, a trick as old as humanity itself. They rediscovered that honey, if they were lucky enough to find a sealed jar, was a powerful natural antibiotic that could be applied to burns and cuts to prevent infection. They were rebuilding an apothecary from the ruins, using a combination of forgotten folk wisdom and the ghost of scientific knowledge. It was a desperate, often inexact science, but it was infinitely better than nothing. Hygiene, a luxury in the old world, became a tactical necessity. A survivor understood that staying clean wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. They would use precious water to wash their hands before eating, not out of politeness, but to avoid dysentery. They would change their socks religiously, knowing that trench foot from constantly damp boots could cripple them, making them easy prey. These small rituals of self-care were not signs of weakness. They were acts of strategic defiance against the slow decay that claimed so many. They were a declaration that you would not be brought down by filth and disease. This constant, nerve-wracking vigilance against invisible threats created a specific kind of mindset. It was a form of disciplined, healthy paranoia that governed every aspect of their lives. They became experts in risk assessment, weighing the need for a resource against the potential for contamination. But this paranoia had to extend beyond just germs and bacteria. As they soon learned, the most unpredictable and dangerous variable in this entire broken equation wasn't the infected or the environment. It was other people, and trusting the wrong person was the quickest and most final mistake you could make. You've mastered the art of silence. You can turn trash into tools and filth into medicine. You have become a finely tuned machine, perfectly adapted to surviving the threats of the dead. But then you see it in the distance, the flicker of a campfire, or you hear a sound that is chillingly familiar, a human voice. For a fleeting moment, your heart leaps with a desperate, ancient longing for connection. But that hope is immediately crushed by a cold, hard calculation of risk. In a world stripped of rules, laws, and consequences, the most dangerous predator is no longer the mindless infected. It is the calculating, desperate, and utterly unpredictable human being. The problem is no longer just about survival. It's about navigating a social landscape where trust is the rarest and most expensive commodity on Earth. The solution, for many, was the development of a kind of tactical misanthropy. You learn to view every stranger not as a potential ally, but as a potential threat. This wasn't born from hatred, but from a brutally pragmatic understanding of human nature under pressure. A friendly wave from a distance could be a genuine greeting, or it could be a tactic to lure you into the open, into the crosshairs of a hidden rifle. A cry for help could be real, or it could be the bait for a well-orchestrated ambush. Survivors became expert readers of body language and intention, analyzing every nuance from a safe distance. Is their posture relaxed or tense? Are their weapons holstered or held at a low ready? Are they alone, or do you sense others hiding nearby? Your life depended on making a character judgment in a matter of seconds, with zero room for error. This led to the creation of unwritten rules of engagement for encounters in the wild. You never approached someone head-on. You circled, using cover, making your presence known without making yourself a target. The initial greeting was a tense dance of mutual suspicion. Conversations were intentionally vague, a game of verbal chess where you tried to get information without giving any away. Where you headed was met with, "That way." What do you have in your pack? Was a line you never crossed. You learned to lie, not maliciously, but defensively. Your past, your destination, the resources you carried, all of it was classified information. Honesty was a luxury you couldn't afford with a stranger. It was a currency you only spent with those who had earned it, often through shared trial and bloodshed. But a life of total isolation is its own kind of death sentence. No one can stay awake forever. No one can patch their own back. The truly successful survivors understood that while indiscriminate trust was suicide, calculated alliances were a necessity. The process of forming a partnership was a slow, deliberate one. It was built on a foundation of mutual benefit and verified action. You didn't trust someone because of what they said. You trusted them because you saw them risk their own safety to save you from a clicker. You trusted them because they shared their last bite of food when you had none. Trust wasn't a feeling. It was a track record. It was a shared ledger of debts and repayments, written in sweat and fear, even within established groups. Whether it was a small band of travelers or a larger community like the one in Jackson, a kind of healthy paranoia remained. People understood that desperation could make good people do terrible things. Resources were still guarded, secrets were still kept, and a certain emotional distance was often maintained as a defense mechanism. The tragedy of this world is that the very thing you need most, human connection, is also the source of your greatest potential danger. Learning to walk that tightrope between utter solitude and reckless trust was perhaps the most complex and emotionally draining skill of all. This constant soul-crushing calculus of who to trust, who to avoid, and who to fight takes a toll that no physical wound ever could. It erodes the spirit, chipping away at your hope and your humanity. After years of this grinding existence, fending off monsters both human and inhuman, a survivor faces the ultimate enemy, the voice in their own head that asks, "Why bother? What could possibly be worth all this pain, all this fear?" The final and most profound act of survival wasn't just about finding food or shelter, but about finding a reason to keep going when every instinct screamed at you to just give up. You've made it. You survived the night, the hunger, the sickness, and the violent desperation of other people. You are a master of this broken world, but as you sit in the quiet dawn, the silence is filled not with peace, but with the ghosts of everything you've lost. The exhaustion is no longer just in your muscles, it's in your soul. The constant vigilance has ground you down to a nub. The fundamental problem, the final boss of the apocalypse, isn't a monster or a man. It is the crushing weight of utter despair. When survival itself is a daily act of suffering, what is the point of continuing to survive? How do you fuel the will to live when the world gives you every reason to let it die? The answer, the most powerful and enduring secret of the survivor, has nothing to do with tactics or tools. It is the art of finding and protecting the non-physical resources, the currency of the soul. The most hardened survivors, the ones who truly made it, understood that you could not live on bread alone. You had to find something to feed your spirit. For many, this came in the form of small, defiant acts of normalcy. Finding a comic book in the ruins of a child's bedroom and reading it by fading light wasn't a waste of time. It was a lifeline to a world where stories mattered. It was a 15-minute vacation from the horror. A survivor might risk attracting attention to play a few chords on a forgotten guitar, not because they were careless, but because the memory of music was a shield against the encroaching silence of despair. These small treasures became the new form of wealth. A stupid pun, a shared joke in the face of certain death, was more valuable than a clip of ammunition because it reignited a spark of shared humanity. Finding a working cassette player and a tape of bad 80s music was a miracle. These weren't distractions. They were anchors. They were tangible proof that the world once held beauty, laughter, and art, and that those things were worth remembering, worth fighting for. They were a reminder that you were not just an animal scrabbling to survive. You were a human being, and that meant something. But the most potent fuel of all was purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that was bigger than yourself. For some, it was a promise made to someone long gone. For others, it was the fierce, primal need to protect someone who was still alive. Look at Joel. He was a hollowed-out shell, a man running on the fumes of grief and cynicism. He survived because he was good at it, but he wasn't truly living. It was the responsibility of protecting Ellie, of having a purpose thrust upon him, that slowly began to refill the well of his humanity. The mission gave his suffering a meaning. His survival was no longer just for his own sake, it was for hers. This is the ultimate truth of this world. You can survive for yourself, but you can only truly live for someone else. In the end, the guide to surviving the world of The Last of Us is about so much more than learning how to be quiet or how to make a bomb. It's a story about the incredible, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. It's a testament to our ability to find genius in the mundane, to build a fortress out of scraps, and to fight invisible wars against disease and despair. It shows us that even when the world is stripped bare, we find ways to create, to connect, and to care. The people who endured this apocalypse were not just survivors. They were librarians of a lost culture, doctors without medicine, engineers without factories, and poets without paper. They were the unsung heroes who proved that as long as there is even one person left with a reason to see the sunrise, a story to tell, or a stupid joke to share, humanity has not just survived, it has won. Picture this. Your tongue feels like sandpaper. Your throat is a desert. and every thought is clouded by a single desperate need: water. You've been walking for hours under a sun that feels pale and wrong, and then you see it. A puddle. Maybe even a slow-moving stream, its surface glittering deceptively in the hazy light. It looks like life. It looks like salvation. But you know better. In the post-nuclear world, the most inviting pool of water is often just a prettier, slower-acting poison. To drink from it is to invite a sickness that rots you from the inside out. This is the first and cruelest paradox of the wasteland. You will die of thirst in a world that is drowning in deadly water. And yet, people survived. They didn't just survive. They learned, adapted, and mastered the art of taming the very element that threatened them. They became post-apocalyptic sommeliers, masters of hydration in a world that wanted them to die thirsty. Their first and most vital skill was not chemistry or engineering, but treasure hunting. The most precious artifacts of the old world weren't gold or diamonds. They were the sealed, perfectly preserved bottles of Nuka-Cola and Sunset Sarsaparilla, sleeping in the dusty wombs of forgotten vending machines. Finding one wasn't just a lucky break, it was a tactical victory. The scavenger who located an untouched Nuka-Cola machine was, for a moment, the wealthiest person in the wasteland. That satisfying hiss upon opening a bottle wasn't just the sound of carbonation. It was the sound of pre-war air, of a world without a sickly green glow on the horizon. It was a sip of pure, untainted hope, a jolt of sugar and caffeine that could fuel you for another day. But this was a finite resource, a fleeting luxury. The true genius of the Wastelander wasn't in finding old-world relics, but in creating new-world solutions when the treasure hunt came up empty. This is where the real ingenuity begins. When faced with nothing but a murky, irradiated river, the survivor had to become an alchemist. The most basic method was, of course, boiling. A crackling fire, a scavenged pot, and water bubbling away. It's a timeless image of purification. Boiling would kill the bacteria and the microscopic monsters that could cripple you with disease. But it did absolutely nothing to remove the invisible killer, the radiation. Drinking boiled, irradiated water was a grim trade-off. You wouldn't be struck down by dysentery tomorrow, but you were still adding to a lethal tally inside your own body, a debt that would one day be collected. So they went a step further. They invented the Wasteland water filter, a masterpiece of scrap-built engineering. Imagine a rusty bucket with a hole punched in the bottom. Into this, a layer of scavenged cloth, followed by a layer of charcoal from their last fire, and then a layer of sand and gravel. It was a medieval tech Brita filter. The cloth and gravel caught the debris. The sand filtered out finer particles, and the charcoal, the masterstroke, helped absorb some of the impurities and the foul taste. It was an ugly, grimy contraption that produced a slow, steady drip of water that was, well, less likely to kill you. It was the difference between certain death and a fighting chance. But even this clever device couldn't remove all the rads. The water was now just a risk, not a death sentence. And managing that risk required a different kind of genius. This final layer of survival was a Faustian bargain, a dance with the devil of pre-war science. If you couldn't fully remove the radiation from the water, you had to manage its effect on your body. This is where two almost mythical substances came into play: Rad-X and Radaway. They were the Wastelanders' guardian angels, delivered via a syringe. Think of Rad-X as a kind of internal radiation sunscreen. A survivor planning to drink from a mostly clean source would take a dose beforehand, coating their insides in a protective layer that helped shrug off the incoming radiation. It was a proactive, strategic move. Radaway, on the other hand, was the most terrifying undo button ever invented. Taken after exposure, it waged a violent war inside your body to purge the radiation you'd already absorbed, leaving you weak and dehydrated, but alive. The art of drinking water became a complex tactical game. How much can I drink before I need Radaway? Do I have enough Rad-X to make this journey? It transformed the simple act of quenching one's thirst into a constant, draining exercise in resource management. They had learned to find, filter, and fortify. Through a combination of scavenging, engineering, and a dangerous reliance on old-world chemistry, they had conquered the immediate threat of thirst. But this constant, desperate battle for something so fundamental as water only served to highlight the next gnawing emptiness. A body that has water still screams for food. And in the wasteland, finding a meal was a whole different kind of nightmare. Imagine the feeling. You've managed to find or filter a few sips of clean water. The sandpaper in your throat is gone, replaced by a dull, aching emptiness in your stomach. It's a hollowness that echoes with every footstep, a gnawing reminder that hydration is only half the battle. Your body, your very cells, are screaming for fuel. But in the wasteland, the question isn't what's for dinner. It's what in this blighted world won't kill me when I eat it. The landscape offers a buffet of horrors. The mutated wildlife scurries with an unnatural speed, and the brightly colored pre-war boxes of food beckon from dusty shelves with the promise of either salvation or a violent case of botulism. To eat in the wasteland is to be a gambler, a chef, and a biologist all at once. The survivors of this world didn't just learn to stomach the unthinkable. They turned the act of cooking mutated abominations into a refined, life-sustaining science. Their resilience wasn't just in their ability to fight, it was in their ability to look at a giant, irradiated cockroach and see a viable source of protein. The first stop for any hungry wastelander was the pre-war pantry, the crumbling supermarkets and abandoned homes that were like time capsules of flavor. But this was a minefield of its own. A can of cram or a box of sugar bombs that looked perfectly preserved on the outside could be a Pandora's box of decay on the inside. Survivors developed an almost supernatural set of senses. They learned to judge a not by its label, but by its weight, the telltale bulge of gas-producing bacteria, the subtle hiss of escaping air. A box of Blamco mac and cheese was a treasure, but you had to check for the tiny holes chewed by mutated insects. Finding a perfectly preserved 200-year-old Salisbury steak was like uncovering Tutankhamun's tomb. It was a taste of a forgotten world, a brief, delicious moment of normalcy in an insane reality. These foods weren't just calories, they were morale. The sweet, chalky rush of a box of sugar bombs could be the psychological boost needed to keep going for another week. A reminder of a time when food was a pleasure, not a risk. But just like clean water, this was a dwindling resource. And when the shelves were finally bare, the wastelander had to turn to the land itself. This is where true grit met grim necessity. The post-apocalyptic ecosystem was teeming with life, but it was life twisted by radiation into grotesque, often aggressive forms. The genius of the wasteland survivor was in their ability to butcher and prepare these creatures, transforming a threat into a meal. Take the radroach. To the uninitiated, it's a skittering, oversized pest, a symbol of nuclear filth. To the seasoned survivor, it's lunch on 6 legs. They knew that the key was in the preparation. You couldn't just eat it raw. The meat had to be cooked thoroughly over a hot fire to kill the parasites and neutralize some of the inherent radiation. A quick sear, a dash of scavenged spices if you were lucky, and suddenly radroach meat became a passable, protein-rich meal. It was a tactical application of heat and knowledge. The same principle applied to the larger, more dangerous creatures. The tough, stringy meat of a mole rat or the surprisingly fatty flesh of a bloatfly had to be understood. Wastelanders became masters of a new kind of culinary arts, learning which parts of a creature were least irradiated, how long to cook the meat to make it safe, and how to use the parts you couldn't eat. Like turning hides into leather or bones into tools. It was a zero-waste philosophy born from absolute desperation. But even with the best cooking methods, eating the local fauna was a constant radiological gamble. Every bite of mutant flesh added to your body's radiation burden. This is where a strange form of wasteland horticulture came into play. Survivors learned to identify and cultivate the strange new plants that had sprung up since the bombs fell. They discovered that certain fungi, like the glowing fungus, while inedible on its own, could be used in strange medicinal concoctions. More importantly, they found that some mutated fruits and vegetables, like the two-headed Brahmin fruit or tato, a grotesque hybrid of a tomato and potato, were not only edible, but also seemed to have properties that helped the body resist radiation. A meal of grilled radstag steak wasn't just the meat, it was the side of boiled tatos that made it survivable. It was a balanced diet, Wasteland style. They were creating their own food pairings, discovering through brutal trial and error which combinations of mutated flora and fauna would sustain them without slowly poisoning them. They had learned to scavenge, to hunt, and to cook in a world that offered nothing but poison. They had become masters of a grim cookbook, their recipes passed down not in books, but through whispered advice around a campfire. They had filled their bellies and found a way to turn the monstrous into the mundane. But a full stomach and a hydrated body are of little use when you have no roof over your head, and the sky itself can turn into a radioactive storm at a moment's notice. The next challenge was not what you put inside your body, but what you put your body inside of. You've managed to eat. You've managed to drink. For a fleeting moment, the basic animal needs are met. But then you hear it. A distant rumble that isn't thunder. The wind picks up, carrying with it a faint, acrid smell, and the telltale crackle of a Geiger counter starting to sing its deadly song. A rad storm is rolling in. In the open wasteland, this is a death sentence. The invisible rain of radioactive particles will cook you alive, seeping into your very bones. You need shelter. Not just a place to sleep, but a fortress against a world that is actively, physically hostile. But where do you find a home in a world of rubble? The answer, for the survivors of the apocalypse, was everywhere. They didn't find homes, they made them. With a level of ingenuity born from pure necessity, they looked at the skeletal remains of the old world and saw not ruins, but raw materials. They became the ultimate architects of survival, building sanctuaries from the very scrap and debris that littered their broken world. The first and most immediate form of shelter was opportunistic. An abandoned highway overpass, a dry concrete pipe, the hollowed-out shell of a building. These were the wasteland's equivalent of a motel. But a true survivor knew that a temporary roof was not enough. The real genius lay in transforming these found spaces into defensible homes. Picture a rusted-out bus lying on its side in a ditch. To a desperate traveler, it's a coffin. To a clever settler, it's the foundation of a fortress. They would drag sheets of corrugated metal to block the windows, weld a sturdy door from road signs onto the frame, and maybe even mount a rickety turret on the roof. That bus was no longer a vehicle. It was a compact, metal-plated home, impervious to all but the most determined attackers. This philosophy was applied to everything. A collapsed house wasn't a tragedy. It was a pre-dug basement with a convenient pile of wood and bricks on top. An entire settlement could spring up in the husk of a pre-war factory, its high walls providing a ready-made defense perimeter. It was the art of seeing potential where others saw only decay. But building walls was only the first step. The true challenge was creating a space that was not just safe, but livable. Inside these scrap metal forts, a different kind of cleverness took hold. Comfort was a forgotten luxury, but small acts of domestic engineering made life bearable. A hubcap could be polished to a dull shine and hung up as a mirror. A tin can, punctured with a nail, became a lantern when a candle stub was placed inside, casting flickering, hopeful shadows on the metal walls. Old-world furniture, miraculously intact, was dragged for miles to furnish these new homes. A dusty couch or a splintered chair was a symbol of status and a defiant reclamation of civilization. They created primitive air conditioning systems by strategically cutting vents to catch the wasteland breeze. and they learned to patch holes not just to keep the rain out, but to control the flow of radioactive dust. Every nail hammered, every scrap of cloth used as a curtain, was an act of rebellion against the chaos outside. It was a declaration that said, "This small, ugly space is mine, and within these walls, I will have order." The pinnacle of this scrap-built civilization was the fortified settlement. Places like Megaton, built around an unexploded atomic bomb, or Diamond City, erected within the confines of a pre-war baseball stadium, were monuments to human collaboration and ingenuity. These weren't just collections of shacks, they were ecosystems. Walkways made of splintered planks connected homes built on top of one another, creating a vertical, chaotic city. They developed rudimentary plumbing, diverting relatively clean water sources through pipes scavenged from derelict buildings. They created marketplaces where goods and stories were exchanged, all under the watchful eyes of guards perched on jury-rigged watchtowers. These settlements were a testament to the idea that while one person could survive in a metal shack, a community could live in a city of scrap. The genius was not just in the physical construction, but in the social engineering required to make it all function. These ugly, ramshackle, and utterly beautiful structures were more than just shelters. They were the heart of the new world. They were proof that humanity could not just endure the apocalypse, but could build a home right in the middle of it. They had found a way to shield their bodies from the physical dangers of the wasteland. But there was another, more insidious threat that no metal wall could stop. It was the invisible, ever-present poison in the air and in the ground, a silent killer that demanded a completely different kind of armor. You've built a home. It's rough, it's ugly, but it's yours. It keeps the rain off your head and the ghouls at the door. You have a small stash of filtered water and some freshly cooked mole rat meat over the fire. For a moment, there is peace. But then you notice it. The water you're drinking, it still has that faint, metallic taste. The meat, no matter how well cooked, leaves a strange warmth in your stomach that isn't from the heat of the meal. And the air itself, sometimes it seems to shimmer. This is the wasteland's most terrifying monster. It has no claws, no teeth, and it makes no sound. It's radiation. The glow. An invisible, patient killer that saturates everything. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? An enemy that is already inside you? Surviving this required developing a sixth sense. It was an intimate, instinctual understanding of an unseen world, a skill set that was part science, part superstition, and all survival. The wastelanders who thrived didn't just live in their environment. They learned to read it, to listen to its silent warnings, and to respect its lethal boundaries. The most valuable tool in this fight was a relic of the old world, the Geiger counter. But to a wastelander, a Pip-Boy or a salvaged counter wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of their own body. They learned to interpret its language of clicks with the nuance of a musician. A slow, intermittent click. Click was the background hum of their world, the acceptable, unavoidable dose. It was the sound of life. But as they moved, they listened. A slight increase in tempo, click, 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 was a warning. It meant, pay attention. Maybe you're walking past a crater or a rusted-out car leaking coolant. It was a signal to change course, to not linger. And then there was the high-pitched, frantic scream of the counter, a sound that chilled the blood more than any predator's roar. That sound meant, run. It meant you had stumbled into a hot zone, a place so saturated with radiation that to stay for even a minute was to sign your own death warrant. They learned to map the world in their minds, not by roads, but by radiation levels, creating invisible corridors of safety through a landscape of death. But what if you didn't have a Geiger counter? This is where the true, almost supernatural genius of the survivor emerged. They learned to read the land itself. They knew that certain types of unnaturally vibrant, sickly green fungi only grew in areas of intense radiation. They knew that pools of water, with a strange, oily sheen on the surface, were poison. They could feel a change in the air, a certain metallic stillness that preceded a radstorm, long before the sky turned a menacing green. And they learned about the ghouls. In the beginning, these radiation-ravaged humans were seen as monsters, omens of the fate that awaited everyone. But the wise survivor came to see them differently. They were the ultimate canaries in the coal mine. A place where even ghouls wouldn't linger was a place of unspeakable contamination. They were not just shambling horrors. They were the living embodiment of adaptation. The ghouls who retained their sanity were walking encyclopedias of radiological survival. They had lived with the glow for so long it had become a part of them, granting them an immunity that was both a blessing and a curse. To see them not as monsters, but as the ultimate survivors, was a profound shift in Wasteland philosophy. Even with the best planning, exposure was inevitable. A sudden radstorm, a misstep into a radioactive puddle, a meal that was a little too hot. This is where the medical miracles of the pre-war world became the most sought-after treasures. We've talked about Rad-X and Radaway in the context of water, but their importance went far beyond that. Rad-X, taken before entering a known hot zone, was a shield. It was a calculated risk, a way of telling your body to brace for impact. But Radaway was a desperate, painful prayer. The process of it working was described as a fire in your veins, a violent purge that left you weak, shaking, and sick, but radiologically cleaner. The decision to use a precious dose of Radaway was never taken lightly. It was an admission of a mistake, a costly reset button. Survivors hoarded these chems like crown jewels, knowing that their very next breath could depend on having a dose ready. They had learned to see the unseen. They had learned to listen to the silence and map the invisible. By combining old-world technology, new-world intuition, and a grudging respect for the adapted, they had found a way to navigate the most treacherous aspect of their home. But surviving the environment was one thing. The wasteland was not empty. It was filled with other survivors, and not all of them were friendly. To protect themselves from the beasts and the bandits, they needed more than just a good sense of direction. They needed tools, they needed weapons, and they needed armor. And for that, they would have to turn to the one resource the apocalypse had created in abundance: trash. You're shielded from the rads. You have a roof over your head, and your stomach isn't empty. You've mastered the quiet threats. But now you hear a new sound. It's not the wind, and it's not the crackle of your Geiger counter. It's the crunch of boots on gravel, accompanied by rough, jeering laughter. Raiders, the human monsters of the wasteland, who see your meager supplies not as the fruits of your hard-won survival, but as an easy score. In this moment, your knowledge of clean water and safe food means nothing. All that matters is the weapon in your hand and the armor on your back. But there are no factories churning out rifles, no foundries forging steel plate. So how do you arm yourself for war in a world without industry? You do it by becoming a disciple of a new religion, the religion of scrap. You learn to see the world not as a junkyard of broken things, but as a cathedral of potential. Every rusted car, every busted machine, every forgotten toy is a holy relic waiting to be repurposed. The wasteland survivor wasn't just a scavenger. They were an artist, a blacksmith, and a mad engineer, capable of turning utter trash into tools of life and death. The core tenets of this religion were simple. Nothing is useless. The patron saints of this faith weren't men, but materials: wonder glue and duct tape. These humble, pre-war adhesives were the lifeblood of post-apocalyptic creation. They were worth more than gold, more than bullets. A roll of duct tape could patch a leaking roof, mend a broken rifle stock, or hold a piece of scrap metal onto your chest as makeshift armor. It was the universal problem solver. Wonder glue could fuse components together with a strength that defied logic, allowing a survivor to combine a rusty wrench with a gas canister and a bit of wiring to create a fearsome, flaming weapon. The true scavenger would risk life and limb for a tube of this stuff, because they knew it was the key to turning their imagination into a tangible, life-saving reality. They learned the sacred geometry of junk, knowing instinctively that a tin can, a cherry bomb, and a pressure plate could be combined to create a deadly landmine. This philosophy transformed the act of weapon creation into an art form. Lacking machined parts and proper tools, they built arms that were as brutal and ugly as the world they lived in. The pipe rifle is the perfect icon of this ingenuity. It's a clumsy, unreliable, and hideous weapon, assembled from lead piping, a wooden stock, and a crude bolt mechanism. It's prone to jamming and about as accurate as throwing a rock, but it fires a bullet, and in the Wasteland, that's all that matters. It's a weapon born of pure necessity, a testament to the idea that if you can't find a solution, you build one, no matter how crude. This creativity knew no bounds. A baseball bat becomes infinitely more persuasive with a few nails hammered through it. A motorcycle handbrake and a few bits of scrap become a single-shot pistol, and the truly gifted, the high priests of the scrap religion, could assemble something like a railway rifle, a pneumatic nightmare that used compressed air to fire railroad spikes with enough force to pin a man to a wall. These weren't just weapons, they were statements. They were proof that human creativity could weaponize literally anything. The same principle of violent repurposing was applied to defense. In a world of bullets, claws, and teeth, your own skin was not enough. So they wore the skin of the old world. A leather jacket was a good start, but why not bolt a car tire to your shoulder for extra padding? Road signs, dented but durable, were cut up and strapped to the chest and legs, providing a surprisingly effective shield against melee attacks. The most iconic of these creations was Raider armor, a chaotic, terrifying amalgamation of scrap metal, leather straps, bones, and cages. It was designed to be as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. To face someone clad in this monstrous, clanking armor was to face the spirit of the Wasteland itself. Savage, resourceful, and utterly insane. It was a visual promise of violence. This deep, almost spiritual connection to junk was the industrial engine of the New World. A survivor's wealth could be measured by the size of their scrap pile. They had learned to look at a broken-down world and see not an ending, but a beginning. They could build a gun from a pipe, a fortress from a bus, and armor from a street sign. They had armed themselves against the horrors of the Wasteland. But what happens when the armor is breached, when a bullet finds its mark or a mutant's claw rips through flesh? In a world without hospitals, the next great challenge was the art of putting a broken body back together again. The fight is over. The raider is down, but not before their blade found your arm. You're bleeding. It's not a fatal wound, not yet. But in the Wasteland, there's no such thing as a minor injury. Every cut, every burn, every broken bone is a ticking clock. Without doctors, without sterile operating rooms, without antibiotics, the smallest infection can blossom into a raging fever that ends your story. The Wasteland itself will finish the job the raider started, using microscopic bacteria as its weapon. How do you possibly perform medicine in a world where the very concept of clean is a forgotten luxury? You do it by becoming your own doctor, surgeon, and pharmacist. The Wasteland medic is one of the most revered and feared figures in this new world, a master of a desperate, bloody art. They operate not with laser scalpels and MRI machines, but with scavenged needles, gut-wrenching courage, and a profound understanding of both pre-war chemistry and post-war biology. The undisputed god of Wasteland medicine is the Stimpack. This pre-war marvel of bioengineering is the single most valuable medical resource in existence. A small, injector-like device, it delivers a cocktail of healing agents, coagulants, and powerful stimulants directly into the user's bloodstream. The effect is almost miraculous. A grievous wound can be sealed in seconds. Pain is dulled, and the user is given a jolt of energy that can mean the difference between collapsing in the dust and getting back into the fight. To find a Stimpack is to find a second life. A survivor would trade a functioning weapon for a single dose because they know a weapon can't save you when you're bleeding out. The use of a stim pack is a sacred act, a moment of pure technological salvation. But they are incredibly rare, and when the stim packs run out, the real gritty work of wasteland surgery begins. Picture this. You have a deep gash from a mutant's claw. There's no stim pack. What do? The wasteland medic gets to work. First, cleansing the wound. There's no antiseptic, so they use the next best thing: cheap, pre-war liquor. Pouring whiskey into an open wound is an exercise in pure agony, a fire that you pray will burn away the coming infection. Next, closing it up. A scavenged sewing needle, sterilized in the flame of a campfire until it glows red hot, becomes the surgical tool. The thread? Sometimes it's actual medical suture, found in a rare first aid kit. More often, it's a piece of twine or even thread pulled from their own clothes. The process is brutal. There is no anesthesia beyond a swig of that same whiskey and a stick to bite down on. Every stitch is a new wave of pain, a battle of will against the body's own screaming protests. It's ugly, it's barbaric, but a poorly stitched wound is infinitely better than an open one. It's a crude but effective barrier against the filth of the world. But what about the threats you can't see? Broken bones, concussions, internal bleeding, or the myriad of strange diseases cooked up by the irradiated environment. This is where the wasteland medic becomes an alchemist, mixing folk remedies with scavenged chems. They learned, through generations of deadly trial and error, the properties of the mutated plants. They knew that a poultice made from crushed bloodleaf could help soothe burns. They discovered that certain types of fungus, when prepared correctly, could create a psychoactive brew that dulled even the most intense pain, albeit with some colorful side effects. They would mix these natural ingredients with crushed-up pre-war medicines, creating their own unique healing salves and powders. A good medic had their own signature recipes, jealously guarded secrets that combined a bit of science, a lot of guesswork, and a dash of luck. Taking one of these homemade remedies was always a gamble. It might cure your ailment, or it might just make you see talking Brahmin for a few hours. They had become masters of mending flesh in a world designed to break it. Using the miracle of the stim pack, the brutal pragmatism of field surgery, and the risky art of post-apocalyptic pharmacology, they found ways to cheat death. They could stitch a wound, set a bone, and fight off an infection. They had patched up the holes in their own bodies. But survival is more than just a series of physical tasks. It's a journey. And a journey requires navigation, information, and communication. In a world where the maps were useless and the roads were gone, how did anyone know where they were going? You're healed. Your armor is patched. You have a little food and water. You are, for all intents and purposes, ready to move. But where do you go? The old world of highways, road signs, and GPS is a distant memory. The landscape has been violently rewritten by the bombs. Roads that once connected cities now lead to impassable craters. Familiar landmarks are rubble. Getting lost isn't an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. A wrong turn can lead you into a nest of death claws, a radiation hot zone, or simply a vast, featureless expanse with no water for 100 miles. In a silent, broken world, how do you find your way? How do you separate life-saving truth from a rumor that will lead you to your doom? You do it by learning to read a new kind of map, a map made of broken things, faint signals, and the whispers of other survivors. The art of wasteland navigation was a delicate blend of ancient techniques and a desperate grasp for the ghosts of old-world technology. It was about finding a signal in the noise. The most fundamental skill was learning to navigate like the ancients. Without a compass, the sun became your guide. A survivor knew instinctively how to find east and west by its path across the sky. At night, in the rare moments when the radioactive haze cleared, the stars provided a fixed point in a chaotic world. They learned to identify constellations not for their beauty, but for their utility. But the sky could only give you a direction, For details, you had to read the ground. They learned to follow the desire paths of the wasteland, the faint trails left by traders and pack animals, the safest routes worn into the earth by those who came before. They learned to navigate by ruin. That tilted skyscraper on the horizon wasn't just a wreck, it was a landmark, a north star of concrete and steel visible for miles. Head for the tall, shiny building, then turn left at the crashed vertibird. This was the language of wasteland cartography. But this world wasn't entirely silent. Information, precious and often unreliable, traveled along human highways. The unsung heroes of this new information age were the traders and caravan masters. These hardy souls, moving between isolated settlements, were the wasteland's internet. They carried more than just goods. They carried news, rumors, warnings, and maps sketched on scraps of leather. A conversation with a passing merchant could be more valuable than a dozen stimpaks. They could tell you that a bridge up ahead had collapsed, that a new group of particularly vicious raiders had taken over the old cannery, or that a settlement a few days' travel to the west was looking for guards and paying in clean water. Learning to barter for information, and more importantly, learning to tell if a trader was trustworthy or just trying to lead you into an ambush, was a critical survival skill. Their word-of-mouth network was the fragile thread that connected the scattered lights of civilization. And then there was the radio. In a world plunged into silence, the faint sound of a voice, or music crackling from a scavenged radio, was nothing short of a miracle. The radio was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the oppressive quiet. A survivor would spend hours carefully tinkering with a broken receiver, turning the dial with the delicacy of a safecracker, hoping to catch a signal. Most of what they found was static, the ghost sounds of the dead world. But sometimes, through the hiss, a signal would emerge. It might be a distress call, a repeating loop pleading for help from a besieged outpost. It might be the formal, polished voice of a powerful faction, like the Brotherhood of Steel or the Enclave, broadcasting propaganda and martial music. Or most precious of all, it might be an independent station, run by a lone DJ in a fortified bunker. These stations, playing pre-war music and offering cryptic commentary on the state of the world, were more than just entertainment. They were proof that someone else was out there, that you weren't alone. Following a radio signal, trying to get closer to its source, became a quest in itself, a pilgrimage toward the sound of another human voice. They had learned to find their way. By reading the sun, the ruins, and the paths of others, they could navigate the physical world. By listening to the traders and the faint whispers on the radio, they could navigate the social and political landscape. They had connected the dots, turning a terrifying, unknown wilderness into a place that could be understood, a place that could be crossed. But this raised the final, most profound question of all. In a world that demanded such brutality, such paranoia, such a focus on the self, what was the point of it all? How did they manage to survive not just the monsters outside, but the monster of despair within? You've done it. You have mastered the wasteland's brutal curriculum. You can filter water from a toxic puddle, cook a meal from a monstrous insect, and build a shelter from the wreckage of the past. You can navigate by the stars, patch your own wounds, and defend yourself with a weapon you built with your own hands. You are a perfect survival machine. But as you sit by your lonely campfire, a silence descends that is deeper than the absence of sound. It's the crushing weight of utter solitude, the constant paranoia, the gnawing fear, the memory of every terrible choice you had to make to get here. They begin to eat away at you. Radiation can kill your body, but despair can kill your soul. What's the point of surviving today if you have to do it all again tomorrow alone? This is the final, and perhaps greatest, challenge of the post-apocalyptic world. It's the fight to remain human. The survivors who truly endured were not just the strongest or the cleverest, but those who understood that the most powerful tool for survival wasn't a rifle or a stim pack. It was another person. The most basic expression of this was the power of a companion. In the wasteland, finding one person you could trust was like finding a new color in a world of gray. A companion was more than just an extra gun in a firefight. They were another set of eyes to watch your back while you slept. They were another mind to help solve a problem, another voice to break the oppressive silence. They were a living, breathing anchor to your own humanity. Sharing a scavenged can of cram with a friend tasted infinitely better than feasting on it alone. The simple act of conversation, of sharing a story or a dark joke about the absurdity of it all, could push back the encroaching madness. And that companion didn't even have to be human. For many, the unwavering loyalty of a dog, like the famous dog meat, was a more reliable and pure form of companionship than any human could offer. A friendly bark was a reminder of a simpler, better world. Even the company of a repurposed robot, with its logical, pre-programmed reassurances, could provide a strange, comforting stability. From this simple seed of partnership, true communities grew. These were the most defiant acts of creation in the entire wasteland. Settlements like Good Neighbor or Rivet City were not just tactical alliances, they were declarations of hope. They represented a collective agreement to try and be something more than just scavengers fighting over scraps. Within the safety of their walls, a fragile new civilization was born. They established laws, crude, often brutal, but laws nonetheless. The unwritten rule of "don't mess with the caravans" or the simple justice of a frontier town were attempts to impose order on a chaotic world. They created economies, where the cap from a Nuka-Cola bottle became a symbol of shared value, allowing a farmer to trade their produce for a mechanic's skill. These places were messy, loud, and dangerous, but they were alive. They were proof that people could come together not just to survive, but to live. They built bars where people could forget their troubles, clinics where they could be healed, and markets where they could feel, for a moment, like part of something larger than themselves. And in these communities, you would find the most powerful survival trait of all, self-sacrifice. You would hear stories of the guard who held a gate against a horde of ferals so others could escape, the doctor who used their last stim pack on a sick child instead of themselves, the scavenger who shared their last sip of clean water with a stranger. These were not acts of tactical advantage. They were acts of pure, illogical, and glorious humanity. They were moments that proved that even after the end of the world, the best parts of it had survived. Each act of kindness, each moment of trust, each display of compassion was a small victory against the cynicism and brutality of the wasteland. It was a flickering candle in an endless dark, a defiant statement that they were not just animals scrabbling for survival. They were people, building a future. In the end, the ultimate guide to surviving the wasteland isn't about how to purify water or which end of a pipe rifle to point at the enemy. It is a story about the incredible, unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. It's a testament to the idea that no matter how much is taken away, our homes, our safety, our world, our ingenuity, our capacity for community, and our desperate, beautiful need to connect with one another can never be extinguished. The people of the wasteland survived not because they were harder or crueler than the world around them, but because, in the face of utter desolation, they chose to remember how to be human. And that is a lesson that will echo long after the last Geiger counter falls silent. Imagine the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a country night, but a dead, oppressive silence that suffocates everything. It's the sound of a world without movement. A world where the titans of industry, the sprawling cities, and the endless highways have all choked and died. In this new world, that silence is the sound of your own death approaching. Picture this: you are stranded. The sun, a merciless hammer in a white sky, beats down on your stalled vehicle. In the distance, a dust cloud signals the approach of those who have not yet fallen silent. Your engine is cold, your heart is pounding. In the wasteland, mobility isn't a convenience. It is life itself. And the source of that life, the one resource that separates the living from the ghosts of the highway, is fuel. But the gas stations have been dry for generations. So how do you feed the beast? How do you make a dead world roar back to life? The answer lies not with kings or warlords, but with the true heroes of the apocalypse, the nameless, grease-stained mechanics who became the high priests of a new religion, the religion of gasoline. The cathedrals of this new faith were not built of stone, but of scavenged chrome and rusted steel. And its central deity was the V8 engine. Think about it. In a world where complex electronics are useless bricks of plastic and silicon, the old-school, carbureted V8 was a miracle of brutal simplicity. It was a mechanical heart, understood not through circuit diagrams, but through the feel of a wrench and the sound of its own breath. These wasteland mechanics, these high priests of combustion, knew its every secret. They could listen to its rhythm and diagnose its ailments like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. They were the keepers of the sacred knowledge, how to time an ignition by ear, how to craft a new gasket from a piece of leather, how to bring a dead engine back from the grave with little more than salvaged parts and sheer force of will. The roar of a V8 engine was no longer the sound of pollution or traffic. It was a hymn of power, a declaration to the empty world that humanity was still here, still fighting, still capable of taming fire and steel. It was a strategic choice born of necessity. The V8 was powerful enough to haul a war machine, yet simple enough to be fixed with a hammer and a prayer. This wasn't just engineering, it was the selection of a new god, one that was loud, demanding, and promised salvation on the open road. But even a god needs a sacrament, and that's where the real genius begins. Finding a working engine was one thing. Finding something to feed it was another entirely. This gave rise to a new kind of artisan, the wasteland alchemist. These were the individuals who stared at the foul, black sludge seeping from the wounds of the earth, the last dregs of crude oil, and saw not poison, but potential. In hidden canyons and fortified compounds, they built makeshift refineries, a terrifying and brilliant art form. Picture a chaotic network of pipes, barrels, and repurposed boilers, all groaning under pressure, heated by a raging fire. The process was a gamble with death. One leaky valve, one miscalculation of pressure, and the entire operation could vanish in a blossom of fire and shrapnel. The smell alone, a thick chemical stench of sulfur and tar, was enough to choke you. Yet they mastered it. They learned to heat the crude, to capture the evaporating fumes, and to condense them back into a liquid. The result wasn't gasoline. It was a foul, unstable, barely combustible slurry they called guzzling, or the juice. It would ruin a modern engine in minutes, but it was the lifeblood of the wasteland. These alchemists weren't just making fuel. They were transforming the very filth of the old world's decay into the one thing that mattered, another day of life. The ingenuity required to build a working still in the middle of nowhere is staggering. It was a desperate, dangerous science, and those who mastered it held the keys to the kingdom. But what happened when even the crude oil ran dry? This is where the nameless mechanic ascended from priest to prophet. They performed the ultimate act of adaptation. They taught the old gods new tricks. They became masters of persuasion, convincing engines designed for high-octane gasoline to consume, well, almost anything that could burn. This was the true art of survival. A mechanic would look at a V8 not as a fixed piece of technology, but as a challenge. They would rejet carburetors, modify intake manifolds, and change compression ratios, transforming the engine into an omnivore. Suddenly, a field of rotting corn wasn't just waste. It was the source for a crude, fermented alcohol that could be fed into a modified engine. The fat rendered from a hunted mutant beast wasn't just for cooking. It could be turned into a primitive biofuel. They were savage innovators, turning the very principles of internal combustion on their head. It was a tactical masterpiece of resource management, born from the simple, brutal equation of the Wasteland. If it burns, it can be fuel. If it can be fuel, it can give you the speed to escape, to fight, and to live. The hero of this world wasn't the warrior with the biggest gun. It was the quiet engineer who could make a rust bucket chug along for one more precious mile on a tank full of glorified moonshine. Their genius ensured that the silence could be broken, that the wasteland would echo not with the whispers of ghosts, but with the defiant roar of an engine. But keeping the machine alive was only one half of the equation, because every thundering war machine, every agile interceptor, runs on more than just a prayer and a tank of gasoline. It runs on a driver. And that driver is beholden to a thirst far more immediate and a liquid far more precious than any fuel ever distilled. The roar of the engine is the sound of life, but it's a thirsty sound. It promises you can outrun the bandits on your tail and the ghosts in your head. But there's one predator you can never outrun, one that doesn't need a supercharged V8 to catch you. It's an enemy that's already inside you, a silent clock ticking away in your own cells. Thirst. In the scorched plains of the wasteland, the sun isn't just a source of light. It's a countdown to your final moments. Your tongue swells, your vision blurs, and your thoughts dissolve into a single desperate prayer for one thing: water. They call it aqua cola, a bitter joke for a substance that has become more valuable than gold, more potent than any ammunition, and the ultimate instrument of power. In a world drowned by sand, how do you find even a single life-giving drop? The answer is a testament to the two extremes of human ingenuity: the grand, oppressive engineering of tyrants, and the quiet, desperate genius of the solitary survivor. For the powerful, water wasn't a resource to be shared. It was a chain to be fastened around the necks of the masses. Warlords like Immortan Joe understood a fundamental truth: control the water, and you control everything. Their solution was brutal in its scale and genius in its psychological impact. They didn't just find water, they enslaved it. Deep beneath their fortresses, they bored into the earth, tapping into the last remaining aquifers, the deep, hidden oceans left over from the old world. Gigantic pumps, resurrected monuments of industrial might, would groan and shudder as they dragged the precious liquid to the surface. But they didn't create an oasis. They built a stage. The water, this aqua cola, would be held in massive cisterns, high above the desperate, parched crowds. Then, in a carefully orchestrated ritual, the floodgates would be opened for a few tantalizing seconds. A torrent of life would cascade down, not to quench thirst, but to demonstrate power. It was a spectacle of control. The message was clear: I am the one who gives you life. Your existence is a gift from my hand. This system wasn't just about hydration, it was about indoctrination. The water wasn't free, it was a currency, and the price was total, unquestioning obedience. For the people below, it was a choice between dying of thirst on their own terms or living on their knees. But what about those who refused to kneel? For the lone wanderer, the outcast, or the runaway, relying on a tyrant's charity wasn't an option. They had to become masters of a subtler, more personal form of engineering. Their survival depended on the art of seeing what no one else could. They became desert scientists, reading the landscape for secrets. A patch of unusually green weeds in a dry riverbed could signal moisture trapped just below the surface. The flight path of a bird at dusk could lead to a hidden spring or a forgotten cistern. They were archaeologists of a forgotten world, seeking out the ghosts of old plumbing in ruined cities, or the damp, cool air of a deep cavern. Their greatest invention, however, was a masterpiece of low-tech brilliance: the dew collector. Picture this. You find a low point in the terrain, a small depression where the cool night air is likely to settle. Before dawn, you dig a small pit and place a container at its center. Over this pit, you stretch a piece of scavenged plastic, a torn sheet, a fragment of a tarp, anything you can find. You weigh down the center of the plastic with a small stone so it sags directly over your container. It looks primitive, almost laughably simple, but it's a work of genius. As the cool night gives way to the morning sun, the moisture in the air and evaporating from the soil condenses on the underside of the plastic sheet. Drop by drop, it trickles down to the lowest point and falls into your cup. It's not much. A few sips, maybe half a cup if you're lucky. But in the wasteland, that half a cup is the difference between seeing the next sunrise or not. This desperate search for water redefined its very meaning. Aqua-Cola wasn't just a drink, it was the ultimate currency. In the barter towns that dotted the wasteland, a full canteen could buy you a weapon, a handful of ammunition, or a week's worth of food. It was a universal standard of value in a world that had lost all others. Think of the strategic implications. A war party wouldn't just raid for guzzolene, they would raid for water, crippling their enemies not with bullets, but with dehydration. A trader's wealth was measured not by the caps or coins in his pocket, but by the slosh of the canteens on his belt. This reality forced survivors to become ruthless accountants of their own bodies. Every drop of sweat was a lost coin. Every breath was a debit of moisture. They learned to move at night, to rest during the blistering heat of the day, and to perform the grim but necessary science of purification. A murky, stagnant pool could be a death sentence, teeming with invisible poisons. So they learned to boil it, using precious fuel. They learned to filter it through layers of charcoal and sand, a primitive but effective way to strain out the filth of a dead world. The knowledge of how to make water safe to drink was just as vital as the knowledge of how to find it. It was a constant, exhausting battle waged on a microscopic level. This relentless focus on a single substance, this lifeblood of the desert, turned every survivor into an engineer and a strategist. They were forced to innovate, whether by building massive, tyrannical pumps or by crafting a simple dew collector from trash. Their ingenuity allowed them to survive the tyranny of the sun. But staying hydrated and mobile was just the beginning of the struggle. For the body is also an engine, and this engine demands a different kind of fuel, a fuel that had become just as scarce and just as strange as Aqua-Cola itself. You have fuel in your tank and water in your canteen. You've outsmarted the sun and outrun the marauders. For a brief, glorious moment, you feel a flicker of security. Then, a new kind of silence descends, a quiet rumbling from deep within your own gut. It's the hollow ache of hunger. An engine cannot run without fuel, and the human body is no different. But in a world where the soil has been scorched into a toxic crust and the supermarkets are hollowed-out tombs picked clean generations ago, what does that engine run on? What exactly is for dinner? The answer is a horrifying yet brilliant look into the art of survival. It's a menu crafted from necessity, resourcefulness, and the grim acceptance that in the wasteland, the word food has been completely and grotesquely redefined. Welcome to the Wasteland Pantry. The first rule of post-apocalyptic dining is simple. If it moves, it's a potential source of calories. Traditional livestock, cows, chickens, pigs, were phantoms of a forgotten world. They were too large, too slow, and required too much clean water and food to survive. The new livestock of the wasteland was small, fast, and horrifyingly abundant. Survivors became tactical entomologists, mastering the art of insect harvesting. A rotting carcass, a sight of pure revulsion to us, was a goldmine to them. It was a thriving farm of maggots, a writhing, protein-rich bounty that could be scooped up, roasted over a fire, and provide the vital energy needed to keep going. Picture this: a lone survivor carefully turning over a rock to find a nest of scorpions or a fat, sluggish lizard. To our sensibilities, it's the stuff of nightmares. To them, it was a strategic victory. They knew which insects were safe to eat, which parts of a mutated lizard were the least toxic, and how to cook them just enough to kill the parasites without wasting precious fuel. This wasn't just disgustingly opportunistic eating. It was a highly specialized form of micro-ranching. They were raising and harvesting the only creatures tough enough to survive the apocalypse right alongside them. Their genius was in seeing a buffet where we would only see a biohazard. For those with a more fortified position, another option presented itself: the archaeology of the old world. Every sealed can, every forgotten bomb shelter, every collapsed basement was a potential treasure chest. This gave rise to a new kind of prospector, one who hunted not for gold, but for the faded labels of canned goods from 100 years ago. It was a game of nutritional roulette. You could pry open a can and find perfectly preserved peaches, a sugary, divine taste of a bygone era. Or you could be met with a hissing black sludge of botulism that would end your story in agonizing detail. This is where brand recognition took on a whole new meaning. Imagine the scene: two survivors bartering, not over the contents, but over the brand of a dusty can of dog food. Dinky Dye might be known for its hearty, if slightly gamey, texture, while a lesser brand might be a notorious gamble. They were connoisseurs of decay. The slight bulge of a can, the faintest rattle. These were clues in a high-stakes investigation. The ultimate prize was anything processed, sugary, and packed with the kind of chemical preservatives that made it functionally immortal. A Twinkie from before the fall wasn't just a snack. It was a legend, a mythical artifact of a world so full of abundance they could afford to create food that never died. But you couldn't survive on hope and dog food forever. The true visionaries looked at the poisoned earth and decided to defy it. The most advanced, and perhaps most hopeful, form of wasteland cuisine was found in the strongholds of the powerful, like the Citadel. Here, the art of hydroponics wasn't a hobby. It was the bedrock of their civilization. In secret caves and reinforced greenhouses, lit by salvaged lights and powered by a humming generator, they achieved the impossible. They grew fresh food. They cultivated algae, fast-growing fungi, and leafy greens in nutrient-rich water, completely bypassing the toxic soil outside. This was engineering on a biological level. These nameless botanists and engineers were the true miracle workers of the apocalypse. They understood chemistry, biology, and engineering, creating a closed-loop system of life in the middle of a world defined by death. They would meticulously manage the pH of the water, ration the light, and cultivate the most resilient strains of plants. The crisp crunch of a fresh lettuce leaf in the Citadel was a symbol of ultimate power, a luxury more profound than any V8 engine or torrent of aquacola. It was a declaration that humanity could not just survive on the scraps of the old world, but could create new life from scratch. It was a living, breathing testament to the idea that no matter how bad things get, ingenuity could still make a garden grow in hell. From a roasted roach on a stick to a hydroponically grown tomato, the ways survivors found to feed themselves were a masterclass in adaptation. They learned to see food everywhere, to ignore their revulsion, and to transform the inedible into the essential. They were forced to become biologists, archaeologists, and farmers, all in the name of answering that one simple, relentless question: what's for dinner? But keeping the body fueled and hydrated was a battle fought on the outside. An equally desperate war was being waged against an invisible enemy that attacked from within, turning the smallest scratch into a death sentence. You've eaten. You've drunk. Your ride is fueled up. By all accounts, you are a king in this desolate world. Then it happens. A moment of carelessness. You're siphoning guzzoline and a rusty pipe slices your arm open. Or you take a tumble on a rocky outcrop and feel a sharp, sickening crack in your leg. In our world, this is an inconvenience. A trip to the emergency room, a cast, a course of antibiotics. In the wasteland, it's a death warrant. There are no doctors, no sterile operating rooms, no pharmacies. There is only the dirt, the rust, and the teeming, invisible armies of infection that thrive in the decay. How do you possibly survive an injury in a world actively trying to kill you? The answer is found by abandoning the idea of the body as something sacred. In the Wasteland, the body is just another machine, and a machine can be fixed. This gave rise to the most pragmatic and brutal of all Wasteland artisans, the biomechanic. The first and most immediate enemy after any injury was not the pain, but the filth. A deep cut from a piece of rusted metal wasn't just a wound. It was an injection of tetanus, gangrene, and 1,000 other horrors. The Wasteland's self-taught medics understood this with chilling clarity. Their first priority was sanitization, and their methods were nothing short of heroic. With no antiseptic solution, they turned to the one thing the Wasteland had in abundance: fire. Cauterization became a standard, if agonizing, medical procedure. Picture the scene. A survivor, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, while a comrade heats a knife or a piece of scrap metal in a fire until it glows cherry red. The searing hiss as it meets flesh is a sound you'd never forget. It was an act of controlled, tactical violence against one's own body. The intense heat would seal the blood vessels, stopping the bleeding, and more importantly, it would burn away any bacteria, creating a sterile, if charred, barrier against infection. In a more delicate situation, they might use the only sterile liquid they could reliably produce: high-proof alcohol, distilled not for drinking, but for dousing a wound in a baptism of fire. This wasn't cruelty. This was a calculated act of survival, a brilliant, if terrifying, application of basic physics to save a life. They were fighting microscopic monsters with the only weapons they had: heat and alcohol. But what about the bigger problems? Broken bones, severed limbs. These were the catastrophic system failures. A survivor with a shattered leg was immobile, a liability, an easy prey. Here, the biomechanic's genius truly shone, as they blurred the line between a scrapyard and a surgeon's table. They treated the human skeleton like a vehicle's chassis, something to be reinforced and welded back into shape. A broken arm could be set and splinted using scavenged rebar and strips of tire rubber. A severe fracture might be stabilized with metal plates, literally bolted onto the bone, using whatever clean screws could be scavenged from a derelict machine. The pinnacle of this biohacking was the creation of crude prosthetics. A lost hand could be replaced with a multi-pronged hook forged from cutlery. A lost leg could be replaced by a sturdy piston from an old engine, creating a clanking but functional new limb. These weren't the sleek, advanced prosthetics of our world. They were noisy, ugly, and uncomfortable. But they worked. They allowed a survivor to walk again, to hold a weapon again, to work again. It was the ultimate act of recycling, treating the human body as a modular system where broken parts could be swapped out. The mechanic who could tune a V8 could also, with a chillingly similar logic, realign a broken femur. The body was just a machine, and they were the ones who knew how to make it run, no matter how many parts had to be replaced. Perhaps the most iconic and ingenious medical innovation of the Wasteland was the concept of the blood bag. In the world of Immortan Joe, this term took on a sinister, parasitic meaning. His war boys, pale and sick from radiation and disease, would physically tether themselves to healthy captives. These captives weren't just prisoners. They were walking, talking, living IV drips. A tube would run from the captive's arm to the war boys, providing a constant, mobile transfusion of clean, healthy blood. It's a horrifying image, but strip away the tyranny and look at the raw, tactical brilliance. In a world with no blood banks, this was the solution. It kept the soldiers on their feet, able to fight at peak condition even when their own bodies were failing. It was a symbiotic, if grotesquely one-sided relationship. For the lone survivor, the principle was the same, though the application was different. A trusted companion could be a universal donor, a walking emergency supply. The knowledge of blood types may have been lost, but the pragmatic understanding that some people's blood was stronger or more compatible would have been discovered through brutal trial and error. This turned the very fluid of life into a strategic, transferable resource. The Wasteland medic, the biomechanic, was a master of brutal pragmatism. They saw a wound not as a tragedy, but as an engineering problem. They used fire, scrap metal, and even other human beings as tools to solve it. They were the unsung heroes who understood that surviving the apocalypse meant not just keeping your car running, but keeping the fragile machine of your own body from falling apart. But patching up your flesh was one thing. You also had to protect it from being torn open in the first place, and for that, you needed armor forged from the very junk that threatened to poison you. You've patched up your wounds, but the world hasn't gotten any friendlier. It's a landscape of jagged metal, flying shrapnel, and blunt force trauma delivered by a rival's war club. Your skin, the original armor nature gave you, is woefully inadequate for this new reality. You need a second skin. You need protection. But there are no factories churning out Kevlar vests, no shops selling riot gear. There is only the endless ocean of refuse left behind by the old world. How do you shield yourself from the violence of the wasteland when all you have is trash? The answer is an explosion of savage creativity. It's the birth of an aesthetic born from pure function, where survivors became visionary artists and engineers, transforming the junk of yesterday into the armor of today. This isn't just about survival, it's about identity, a defiant declaration hammered together from the wreckage of civilization. The fundamental principle of wasteland armor is repurposing. A survivor would look at a scrap heap not as a pile of garbage, but as a disassembled arsenal waiting to be worn. The prime real estate was anything that was designed in the old world to withstand impact. This made the discovery of a forgotten high school or sports stadium a monumental event. Old football pads, the shoulder, chest, and thigh protectors, were a godsend. They were lightweight, articulated for movement, and designed to absorb shock. A set of football pads, strapped over worn leather, was the wasteland equivalent of a knight's plate mail. But the true genius lay in seeing potential everywhere. Tires became the ultimate raw material. Their thick, reinforced rubber was surprisingly resistant to slashes and blunt impacts. Survivors would cut them up, layering the treads over their chests and shoulders, creating a flexible yet durable form of ablative armor. A hubcap wasn't a decorative piece of chrome. It was a perfect, pre-made buckler shield. A street sign made of thick gauge aluminum could be bent and bolted onto a vehicle door or worn as a massive pauldron. Every piece of gear told a story, a history of where its owner had been and what they had scavenged. This wasn't manufactured anonymous protection. It was a wearable resume of your own resourcefulness. This philosophy of salvage extended beyond defense and into offense. The same hands that could craft armor could also forge weapons of terrifying ingenuity. With firearms being unreliable and ammunition a precious, finite resource, the art of melee combat was reborn, and the weapons were as personalized and resourceful as the armor. A simple kitchen knife, a mundane tool from the old world, became a deadly shiv. But why stop there? A clever scavenger would mount that knife onto the end of a scavenged pipe, creating a makeshift spear, adding crucial distance between themselves and a rabid attacker. The creativity was breathtaking in its brutality. A heavy-duty wrench, already perfectly weighted for a crushing blow, would be improved with sharpened bolts drilled through its head. A lawnmower blade, sharpened to a razor's edge, would be mounted onto a handle to become a crude but devastatingly effective sword. Perhaps the most iconic is the war club, a simple piece of wood elevated into an instrument of terror. Survivors would hammer nails, bottle caps, and shards of metal into it, turning a simple bludgeon into a weapon that would tear and snag flesh. Each weapon was a unique masterpiece of pain, a custom-built solution to the problem of close-quarters survival. It was a level of personalization that made every fight a unique clash of twisted, homemade art. But how did they hold all this gear together? The unsung hero of all wasteland fashion and function is the simple strap and buckle. In a world without welding shops on every corner, The ability to securely fasten a piece of armor or a weapon holster to your body was paramount. Leather was the fabric of choice. It was durable, flexible, and could be harvested from the cracked seats of abandoned cars, old couches, or even the toughened hides of mutated beasts. Survivors became expert leather workers, not for aesthetics, but for pure utility. They would cut, punch, and stitch, creating a complex web of belts and harnesses that held their entire survival kit together. Think of the intricate rig worn by Max himself. It's not a fashion statement. It's a masterpiece of ergonomic engineering. Every strap has a purpose. Every buckle is strategically placed. The leg brace is not just medical equipment. It's integrated into the whole system. The shotgun holster is perfectly positioned for a quick draw. This network of leather was the chassis that the armor and weapons were built upon. It was a silent testament to the countless hours of maintenance, adjustment, and field testing required to make a walking arsenal feel like a part of your own body. It was the art of making sure that when things went sideways, your life-saving gear didn't fall off. This salvage punk aesthetic was more than just practical. It was a form of psychological armor. By covering yourself in the intimidating refuse of the past, in spikes and skulls and sharpened metal, you became a part of the terrifying landscape. You were no longer just a soft human target. You were a monster, a ghost of the road, a creature who had mastered the junk and wore it as a crown. But even the best armored warrior is vulnerable in the open. To truly dominate the Wasteland, they had to take this philosophy of armored survival and apply it to the one thing that truly mattered: their ride. You are armored. You are armed. You are a walking testament to the art of survival. But on foot, you are an island in a vast, hostile ocean. The Wasteland is measured in horizons, not footsteps. And to be stranded in the open is to be a target for every predator circling in the dust. A simple car gives you speed, a way to chase the horizon. But a standard vehicle, a relic from the old world, is a paper-thin shell. It offers mobility, but no real safety. How do you transform a fragile machine of transport into a bastion of survival? How do you build a castle that can move at 100 miles an hour? The answer is to stop thinking of your vehicle as a car and start thinking of it as your home, your shield, and your sword, all rolled into one. This is the art of building a mobile fortress, the pinnacle of wasteland engineering, where the vehicle becomes a self-contained ecosystem on wheels. The first step in evolving a car into a war machine is defense. A wasteland mechanic would look at a standard sedan and see only vulnerabilities. The windows, glass shatters. The doors, thin sheet metal. The tires, exposed and easily shredded. The process of fortification was a masterclass in applied brutality. Doors would be welded shut, reinforcing the frame and removing a weak point. Windows would be replaced with steel plates, with only narrow, horizontal slits left for the driver to peer through, just enough to see the road, but not enough for a raider's bullet to find its way in. The exterior of the vehicle would become a canvas of defensive scrap. Sheets of corrugated metal, chain link fence, and even sharpened rebar would be bolted or welded onto the chassis. This wasn't just armor, it was a psychological weapon. A car bristling with spikes and jagged metal doesn't just look intimidating. It actively discourages other vehicles from getting too close. The most iconic feature, of course, was the cow catcher, or ramming grill. These massive steel plows, often scavenged from old trains or construction equipment, were welded to the front, turning the entire vehicle into a multi-ton battering ram. It was a proactive defense, a declaration that the best way to survive a collision is to be the one who causes it. Once the shell was hardened, the vehicle had to become a weapon. This is where the ingenuity of the wasteland gunsmith and the mechanic merged. Mounts would be welded onto the roof, the hood, and the sides, creating platforms for a dizzying array of scavenged weaponry. A harpoon gun, powered by a CO2 canister, could be used to snag an enemy vehicle and reel it in. Flamethrowers, fed by a tank of precious gasoline, could spew liquid fire, clearing a path or denying an area to attackers. But the true genius was in the integration. Think about the warboys on the pursuit vehicles. They weren't just passengers. They were part of the car's offensive system. They would swing from lancer poles using explosive-tipped spears to attack from above. Others would be strapped to the sides, acting as mobile gun turrets. The car and the crew became one symbiotic fighting organism. Even the wheels became weapons. Spiked hubs, like the chariots of ancient Rome, would shred the tires of any vehicle that dared to pull alongside. The car was no longer just a ride, it was a predator, actively hunting and defending its territory on the asphalt. The ultimate expression of this philosophy is not a car, but a behemoth. The war rig. It is more than a vehicle. It's a mobile civilization, a rolling testament to what humanity can achieve when pushed to the absolute limit. Look at its design. The rig is not one thing, but many things at once. It's a cargo hauler, a warship, a barracks, and a life support system. The massive tanker trailer it pulls contains the most precious resources, gasoline and aqua-cola, the very lifeblood of a settlement. The cab is an armored command center, a fortress in its own right. The sheer level of detail in its self-sufficiency is what's truly brilliant. It has its own defensive turrets, its own living quarters, and even its own repair bay stocked with spare parts. The crew, like the Vuvolini, are not just passengers. They are a dedicated team, each with a specific role in keeping the beast alive and defending it from parasites. The war rig is the Wasteland's equivalent of an aircraft carrier. It projects power, sustains a community, and can endure a prolonged siege. It is the masterpiece of those nameless mechanics and engineers, the ones who saw a rusty semi-truck and envisioned a kingdom on wheels. It's the ultimate proof that in this world, home is not a place you go to. It's a thing you build and drive. The fortress on wheels was the key to conquering the vast distances of the wasteland. It was a perfect fusion of armor, weaponry, and life support. It allowed survivors to not just exist in the world, but to move through it with a measure of safety and authority. They had solved the problems of fuel, water, food, and defense. But one final, insurmountable challenge remained. A threat that no armor could stop, no engine could outrun, and no weapon could destroy. It was the war within, the fight for their own sanity in a world gone completely mad. The engine goes quiet. The dust settles. You are safe inside your rolling fortress, with a full belly and a canteen of clean water. For the first time all day, there is nothing to fix, nothing to fight, nothing to flee from. And in the ringing silence, you are finally alone with the one enemy you cannot build armor against, the one predator you can't outrun, and the one wound you can't cauterize with a hot knife. You are alone with your own mind. In a world defined by unimaginable loss, constant violence, and the daily shattering of every norm you once knew, how do you keep your sanity from cracking like sun-baked earth? What do you hold on to when the trauma is relentless? This is the final and most profound challenge of the wasteland, and the solutions are the most desperate and brilliantly human of all. This is the art of psychological survival, the power of prayer, even to a god of your own making. For many, the only way to endure a meaningless existence was to embrace a new, all-consuming meaning. This was the dark genius of warlords like Immortan Joe. He didn't just rule his warboys, he gave them a tactical framework for their despair. Consider the warboys, a generation born into sickness, their bodies failing them from birth. They had no past and no hope of a future. This is the perfect recipe for nihilism. Joe's masterstroke was to hijack that nihilism and turn it into fuel. He created a religion, the cult of the V8, the worship of the chrome spray, and the promise of a glorious afterlife in Valhalla. It was a perfectly engineered belief system for a broken world. It took their short, painful lives and reframed them not as a tragedy, but as a heroic arc. Their death in his service wasn't an end. It was a transcendence. The cry of "Witness me" was not a plea for attention. It was the climax of their entire existence. This madness was, in fact, a brilliant psychological tool. It gave them purpose, identity, and a sense of belonging. It replaced the fear of a pointless death with the ecstatic pursuit of a glorious one. It was a prayer shouted into the void, and it gave them a reason to die, which, in a twisted way, was the only thing that allowed them to truly live. But not all faiths were built on death and glory. For others, the anchor of sanity was not a promise of the future, but a memory of the past. Look at the Vuvalini, the many mothers. Their world was just as harsh, their losses just as profound. But their survival was fueled by a different kind of belief, the living folklore of the green place. For them, the green place wasn't just a destination on a map, it was a shared dream, a sacred story passed from one generation of women to the next. It was the memory of a world with clean water, soft earth, and growing things. This belief was their psychological armor. In a world of rust and dust, the idea of greenness was an act of radical hope. It gave their struggle a higher purpose. They weren't just running from a tyrant, they were on a pilgrimage. It informed their every action, from their fierce defense of their seed bank to their unshakable solidarity. The green place was their North Star, a fixed point of beauty in a universe of ugliness. It didn't matter if it was real anymore. Its power was in the act of believing in it together. It was a prayer whispered against the harsh wind, a promise that something better once existed, and therefore could exist again. And what if you have no tribe to believe with? What if you are utterly alone, adrift with only your own memories for company? This is the lonely road walked by survivors like Max. His sanity is a ruin, haunted by the ghosts of those he failed to save. His visions, the faces of the dead that flicker at the edges of his sight, are not a belief system. They are the scars of his soul made visible. And yet, in a terrible and paradoxical way, they are also his salvation. His madness is not an escape from reality. It is a constant, brutal confrontation with it. The ghosts don't offer him comfort or glory. They are a relentless reminder of his own humanity, of the connections he has lost. They are the engine of his survival. He runs, not just from his enemies, but from his own grief. And in that running, he ironically finds his purpose. He is forced, again and again, to intervene, to help, to save others, perhaps as a desperate, private ritual, to appease the ghosts that ride with him. His prayer is a silent, unending dialogue with his own pain. It's the tether, however frayed, that keeps him from becoming the same kind of monster he hunts. It's the proof that even in the most shattered mind, a flicker of the person you once were can be the very thing that keeps you going. In the end, the true genius of the Wasteland survivor is not found in the roar of a V8, the glint of scavenged armor, or even the clever collection of a single drop of water. It is found in these desperate, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying acts of belief. The prayer in Gas, Water, and a Prayer is not a plea to a higher power. It is the prayer of the mechanic's wrench turning one last bolt. It is the prayer of the mother telling her child a story of a green world. It is the prayer of a haunted man choosing to help a stranger. It's a testament to the fact that even when the world has ended, humanity's most powerful resource, our sheer, stubborn, brilliant refusal to lie down and die, will always, always find a way to survive.